The sea was calm that night, the kind of stillness that fishermen along the Corinthian Gulf would later describe as unnatural, almost deliberate, as though the water itself was holding its breath. Then, without warning, the earth convulsed. Temples cracked apart in an instant. Stone columns that had stood for centuries snapped like dry branches. And before the people of the city could even understand what was happening, a wall of seawater rose from the darkness and swallowed everything whole. By dawn, an entire city, its streets, its shrines, its harbor, its thousands of inhabitants, had vanished beneath the waves, leaving no trace above the surface of the earth. For more than 2,000 years, no one could say exactly where it had gone. Ancient writers spoke of it with a strange mixture of awe and dread, as though naming it too carelessly might invite the same fate. Some believed the gods had erased it on purpose. Others insisted it was still down there, intact, waiting in the silence beneath the gulf. This is the story of Helike, a city so completely consumed by catastrophe that antiquity itself treated it as a warning, a place that seemed as though it was never meant to be found again. Before we descend into the mystery, if stories like this, cities erased from the map, civilizations undone by forces they never saw coming, pull you in the way they pull us in, take a moment now to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps bring more of these forgotten histories back into the light, and there is a great deal more waiting to be uncovered here. To understand how a thriving city could disappear so completely, we have to go back to a time long before its final night, back to the rolling hills and fertile plains of ancient Achaea in the northern Peloponnese of Greece. Here, along the southern shore of the Corinthian Gulf, the land was generous. Rivers flowed down from the mountains, depositing rich soil across a wide coastal plain. Olive groves and vineyards spread across gentle slopes, and the sea itself offered both sustenance and opportunity, a highway for trade rather than a barrier. It was in this landscape, sometime in the early first millennium BCE, that the city of Helike began to rise. Historical and archaeological evidence indicates that Helike was already a significant settlement by the 8th century BCE, and it would go on to become one of the most important cities in the Achaean League, a political and religious center whose influence stretched across the region. Helike's importance was not merely political or economic. It was, above all, sacred. The city was renowned throughout the Greek world as the principal cult center of Poseidon Helikonios, god of the sea, and, fatefully, god of earthquakes. Ancient sources tell us that Helike housed one of the most revered temples to Poseidon in all of Greece, a sanctuary so respected that other cities across the Ionian world, including colonies far across the Aegean, claimed descent from Helike's religious traditions and sent offerings back to the mother city in recognition of that sacred bond. The historian Strabo, writing centuries later, recorded that the Ionians, who had once inhabited the Peloponnese, held Helike in such high esteem that they modeled their own worship of Poseidon after the rites performed there. To stand in Helike's sanctuary, then, was to stand at the spiritual heart of an entire branch of Greek civilization. Picture, for a moment, what it would have meant to approach Helike in the years of its prosperity. A traveler arriving from the coastal road would have first caught sight of smoke rising from household hearths and the glint of sunlight on bronze votive offerings carried toward the temple precinct. The air would have carried the scent of salt from the nearby gulf, mixed with the earthier smell of olive presses working through the harvest, and beneath it all, the low, constant murmur of a city going about its business, cartwheels grinding over packed earth streets, merchants calling out prices in the agora, the rhythmic clang of a bronze worker's hammer. Sheep and goats would have been driven along the outskirts toward pasture, their bells clinking faintly in the warm air. Closer to the heart of the city, the traveler would have seen substantial stone buildings, evidence of organized urban planning, and the unmistakable grandeur of the sanctuary itself, its columns catching the light in a way that must have seemed, to visitors from smaller towns, almost otherworldly. Helik's wealth came from a combination of fertile agricultural land, control of local trade routes, and the prestige and pilgrimage traffic generated by its religious significance. The Achaean League, of which Helik was a leading member, functioned as a confederation of city-states that cooperated on matters of defense and diplomacy, and Helik's role within this league gave it political weight beyond what its size alone might suggest. It minted its own coinage, engaged in trade across the Gulf, and maintained the kind of civic infrastructure, streets, public buildings, defensive walls, that marked it as a serious urban center rather than a minor coastal town. Its population at its height is estimated by historians to have numbered several thousand, a substantial figure for a Greek city of that era. And yet, for all its prominence, Helike sat upon ground that concealed a terrible vulnerability, one that no ancient engineer could have detected and no priest could have prayed away. The Corinthian Gulf lies along a tectonically active fault system, a fact modern seismology has only fully understood in recent generations. The coastal plain where Helike stood was built, unknowingly, upon a landscape shaped by repeated fault movement, its very fertility a product of geological forces that could, without warning, turn destructive. In the winter of 373 BCE, those forces finally converged. According to the ancient historian Diodorus Siculus, writing roughly 3 centuries after the event, but drawing on earlier sources, the destruction of Helike began with a violent earthquake that struck at night, when most of the population would have been indoors and asleep. The tremor was so severe that it brought down buildings across the city almost instantaneously. Diodorus recorded that this catastrophic shaking was followed within moments by an enormous wave surging in from the Gulf, a wave that engulfed the ruined city so completely that, in his words, the entire population perished and no bodies were ever recovered for burial. The Greek geographer Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century CE, offered a similar account, describing how Helike was overwhelmed by the sea following the earthquake, and noting that in his own time, sailors navigating the Gulf could reportedly still see the remains of the city's bronze statue of Poseidon submerged beneath the water, its trident said to pose a hazard to fishing nets that snagged upon it. Whether that particular detail reflects a genuine surviving landmark or a legend that grew up around the tragedy, historians cannot say with certainty, but the persistence of the story across centuries reflects how deeply the memory of Helik's destruction embedded itself in the Greek imagination. It is worth pausing here to separate what ancient testimony tells us from what later legend added to it. The core historical claim that Helike was destroyed by an earthquake accompanied by a devastating inundation from the sea, likely what modern scientists would recognize as a tsunami or a coastal collapse triggered by seismic activity, is corroborated across multiple ancient sources writing independently of one another, including Strabo, Pausanias, and Diodorus Siculus, as well as briefer references in other classical texts. This convergence of testimony gives historians reasonable confidence that a real catastrophic event occurred. What remains legendary, however, are the more embellished details that accumulated over time, particularly the moralizing tradition that framed the disaster as divine punishment. Ancient writers reported a tradition, which they treated with some skepticism even in antiquity, that the citizens of Helike had committed a grave religious offense by killing suppliants who had sought sanctuary at the altar of Poseidon, and that the god destroyed the city in retribution. This narrative served a clear cultural purpose, reinforcing the sanctity of supplication and the dangers of impiety, themes that recur throughout Greek religious storytelling. But it should be understood as a moral legend layered onto a historical catastrophe, not as an explanation modern historians treat as literal cause. In the aftermath, Helike did not simply fade from memory, at least not immediately. Ancient accounts describe how the site remained for some time, visible or partially visible beneath shallow water near the shore, a haunting presence that travelers could look upon and reflect on the fragility of even the most sacred and prosperous cities. But as decades and then centuries passed, sediment carried down from the rivers that had once made the plain so fertile gradually buried the ruins, and coastal geography shifted further still. The precise location of Helike slipped from certain knowledge into the realm of scholarly debate and popular myth. Some scholars in later antiquity speculated the ruins lay far out in the Gulf, permanently underwater. Others suggested the coastline had shifted so significantly that the site might actually now lie on dry land, buried beneath meters of accumulated silt rather than beneath the sea itself. This uncertainty persisted for well over 2,000 years, during which numerous expeditions attempted and failed to locate any definitive trace of the city. If you find yourself wondering how a city this significant, this well documented by multiple ancient historians, could remain lost for over 2 millennia, you are asking exactly the question that drove generations of archaeologists to keep searching long after most had given up hope of ever finding an answer. It is worth sitting with that question for a moment. What does it take for a place to be erased so thoroughly that even knowing its approximate history is not enough to locate it? I would genuinely like to know what you think happened to the certainty of its location over those centuries, and whether you believe places like this can ever be fully reclaimed by history. Share your thoughts in the comments, because these are exactly the kinds of mysteries worth discussing. The modern search for Helike began in earnest in the 20th century, as archaeologists increasingly turned their attention to underwater exploration technology, believing, based on the ancient sources describing submerged ruins, that the city must lie somewhere beneath the Gulf itself. Numerous underwater surveys were conducted off the coast near the presumed location, and various promising leads emerged over the decades, yet none produced conclusive evidence of an actual city. It was not until the work of Greek archaeologist Dora Katsanopoulou, beginning in the 1980s and continuing through sustained excavation efforts in the years that followed, that the mystery began to unravel in an entirely unexpected direction. Katsanopoulou's research proposed a striking reconsideration of the ancient accounts. Rather than remaining permanently submerged beneath the sea, she argued, the ruins of Helike might actually lie inland, buried not beneath ocean water, but beneath a coastal lagoon that had formed after the earthquake, subsequently filled in over the centuries by sediment deposited by 2 nearby rivers. This theory shifted the search away from the open Gulf and toward the coastal plain itself. In 2001, after years of careful geological survey and painstaking excavation, this approach yielded a breakthrough. Archaeologists uncovered building remains, pottery, and other artifacts beneath several meters of clay and silt near the modern village of Rizomilos in a location consistent with ancient descriptions of Helike's position relative to nearby rivers and the coastline. Radiocarbon dating and stratigraphic analysis of the site indicated occupation layers spanning a considerable period, including a destruction layer consistent with catastrophic collapse. Subsequent excavation seasons revealed even more. Archaeologists uncovered the remains of buildings with stone foundations, sections of paved roads, and evidence of organized urban structure consistent with a substantial ancient settlement. Pottery fragments recovered from the site have allowed researchers to establish a chronology of occupation stretching back centuries before the catastrophic event, indicating that the location had been continuously inhabited long before the disaster that ancient sources describe, and that the destroyed classical city sat atop even earlier settlement layers, suggesting the area's habitability and strategic value endured across generations, despite the geological risks lurking beneath it. Coins bearing inscriptions associated with the Achaean city have also been recovered from the region, lending further material support to the identification of the site with historical Helike, alongside earlier discoveries in the area, including bronze artifacts and older finds that had hinted at the city's presence long before the definitive excavations began. What makes this discovery so remarkable is not simply that a lost city was found, but how thoroughly its rediscovery confirmed details recorded by ancient historians writing centuries after the disaster itself. The layer of destruction, the sudden abandonment, the burial beneath water-deposited sediment rather than volcanic ash or wind-blown dust, all of it aligned with the seismic and hydrological catastrophe described by Diodorus and Pausanias. It is a rare and satisfying convergence between literary testimony and physical evidence, the kind of confirmation that archaeologists spend entire careers hoping to achieve. And yet, significant portions of the site remain unexcavated, buried beneath farmland and shifting water tables that make continued archaeological work slow, expensive, and technically demanding. The full extent of the ancient city, including the location of its famed temple to Poseidon, has not yet been definitively established, meaning that Helike, even in rediscovery, continues to hold on to some of its secrets. Consider what daily life must have looked like in Helike before that final night, drawing on what excavation and comparative archaeology of Achaean city-states can tell us. Families would have lived in modest stone and mud brick houses, clustered along narrow streets, their daily routines governed by agricultural cycles, religious festivals, and the rhythms of the nearby sea. Farmers would have tended olive trees and grain fields on the surrounding plain, while others worked as fishermen, potters, or traders, moving goods along the Gulf. Civic and religious life would have intertwined constantly, with public sacrifices, processions, and seasonal festivals honoring Poseidon forming a central part of communal identity. Craftsmen would have produced pottery and bronze work, some of which likely traveled well beyond Helike itself through the trade networks the Achaean League maintained. It was, by every indication, an ordinary and prosperous Greek city, filled with people living lives of labor, worship, family, and modest ambition, entirely unaware that the ground beneath their feet carried the potential for annihilation. The tragedy of Helike lies precisely in that ordinariness. This was not a city that fell to invasion or slow decline, the fate that eventually claimed so many ancient settlements. It was a city functioning at the height of its prosperity, its temples active, its harbor busy, its population going about the unremarkable business of daily life, when the earth itself turned against it in a matter of moments. Ancient writers understood this, which is likely part of why the story of Helike endured so persistently in Greek memory, even after its precise location was lost. It served as a stark reminder that human permanence, however solid it appears, remains subject to forces beyond human control or comprehension. Some mysteries surrounding Helike remain genuinely unresolved even after its rediscovery. Archaeologists continued to debate the precise sequence of events on the night of the disaster, whether the destructive wave arrived from the sea itself or resulted from the sudden subsidence and flooding of the coastal lagoon following the earthquake, a distinction that matters both scientifically and for understanding exactly how the ancient accounts should be interpreted. The exact number of inhabitants lost, and whether any survivors managed to escape inland before the water arrived, cannot be determined with certainty from either the textual or archaeological record. And the location of the great temple of Poseidon Heliconios, the sacred heart of the ancient city, and the reason so many across the Greek world once looked toward Helike with reverence, remains undiscovered, hidden somewhere beneath the layers of clay and farmland that still cover much of the site. Before we close, if this exploration of a city swallowed by catastrophe and lost for over 2,000 years captured your imagination, consider subscribing for more historical documentaries exploring the civilizations, disasters, and discoveries that continue to shape our understanding of the ancient world. There are many more stories like this one waiting to be told. What remains in the end is a quiet and unsettling truth. Helike was not hidden by human hands, nor deliberately erased from memory by conquerors seeking to claim its legacy. It was simply overtaken in a single night by the same fertile, restless earth that had made it prosperous in the first place, and then patiently buried by the very rivers that had once sustained its fields. For over 2,000 years, it existed only as testimony, a name recorded in the careful prose of ancient historians who themselves could only wonder at exactly where the city lay. Its eventual rediscovery stands as a rare victory of patient scholarship over the erosions of time, yet even now, beneath the soil of that quiet Greek plain, portions of Helike remain unseen, its temple to the god who destroyed it still waiting somewhere in the dark. Perhaps that is the truest lesson this vanished city leaves behind, that civilizations, however grand, however sacred, can disappear almost entirely from the surface of the world, and that even when we find our way back to them, some part of what they were remains forever out of reach, an echo beneath